No toca Adair sitlarin Necalli. Newar wanotatsin dewankoilteka. Nonantsin yechdurantekatl. I just spoke to you in Nahuatl, an indigenous language in Mexico, descended of the Aztec Empire. I told you my name, though you can call me Addie. I said that my father and I are from Coahuila, and that my mother's from Durango, 2 states in northern Mexico. It is said that the Nahua people are born of the marriage between sun and earth, and that our souls are no different between the people who have already passed and the people who have yet to come. That's why history is so important to me, because I am no different from my ancestors. They live within me, and I will live within my progeny. History, though, has rarely been on my people's side. It's never really been about explaining what happened in a war or in an election. More often than not, history has been about justifying what happened in our past so that we can feel content with the present. History happens when an event is decided that it's important enough to be written down in the country's records for some curious and accomplished historian to later find. That historian then writes about it, but he's already been influenced by a lifetime of government-issued education and racial propaganda biasing him against Native people, making him think that we're wild, lazy, or uneducated. And the texts that he's reading have already been written in a European viewpoint, making that government look as clean and righteous as possible. The textbooks resulting from that work later get edited and reviewed by school boards, filled with teachers and parents, administrators, policymakers, who rarely have any academic background in history. And they're done at a local level, state by state and country by country, and county by county, so that there's rarely any influence from a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds. Something as simple as colonization should be recognized in every history book, but this Canadian one describes the banning of First Nations people from Canada as a voluntary agreement between them and European settlers because they needed land to live on. So much of what's been taken from us is never actually recognized in most books. For example, did you know that Indigenous people in the United States didn't have a right to practice their religions until 1978? That's 40 years ago. Though this right wasn't actually protected very well until its 1994 amendments. Many of you, most of you, were alive during a time when an Indigenous ceremony anywhere in this country could have resulted in their imprisonment. In Mexico, where I'm from, reservations and Indigenous property rights don't really exist. Any historical landmark is protected by the government, claimed and regulated so that I, having Nahua ancestry, have to pay 70 pesos to simply look at a piece of my people's history and read blatant lies on the placards. In regards to that, I want to get one thing straight. The Nahua people of the Aztec Empire didn't do this. I would avert your eyes if you don't like blood. Now that's physically impossible. Cardiothoracic surgeons say that the sternum is entirely too strong for a simple stone knife to break through it. And the heart is protected by layers and layers of muscular and connective tissue, so you really can't just stick your hand in a person's chest and rip their beating heart out. But you don't know how much it hurts that this is the first thing many of you think of when you hear my ancestors' names. Some historians also claim that my ancestors would skin their victims for any myriad of reasons, be it war or sacrifice. But let me throw a little wrench of doubt into that. The original evidence from this claim came from the text using the word tlakashipewalistli, because the original translator derived the words man to skin and action from this word. And because I assume few or none of you speak Nahuatl, I'm sure this makes sense to you. But native speakers of this language know that this doesn't make sense in our normal grammatical structures or within our culture. The more accurate etymology of this word is tlacati, xiwit, pewa, and nistli, which create the word meaning a plant begins to be born. It's spring. The word means the season of spring. This discovery was made by a university professor in Puebla named Genaro Medina Ramos. Being of Nahua ancestry himself and a first language speaker of Nahuatl, he was able to see the true meaning of this word when he came across it. From him, I learned how prevalent the issue of mistranslation is in Native history. See, when a historian doesn't have first language knowledge of a language that they're translating, and that includes cultural proficiency, mistakes will happen. But when that historian or translator already has preconceived notions of the society that they're studying, they might be willing to believe their mistranslations, even ones as bad as this one. But for me to have to tell you this here, now, at a university TEDx talk, is the problem. It is not okay for our children to have to be re-educated after graduation. School is supposed to be the method by which we create informed and productive citizens, not the tool with which we're convinced of falsities, simply because we're not willing to look at our educational systems and our textbooks with a critical eye. Simply because we're content with the misinformation that we've been given after 500 years of colonization. But my ancestors fought too hard for my existence for me to be content with the stories that academia tells about them. And this is not just a K-12 issue. Universities need to be held accountable too. A class that I took on human rights showed that movie that I just showed depicting Aztec heart removal. What you now know is anatomically impossible, and they treated it as fact. The only class here that is exclusively about Native American history uses a fictional novel to teach about the political and cultural relations between First Nations, French Canadian, and Northern American tribes. Our country's most elite universities pride themselves on being a bastion of knowledge, on the cutting edge of academics. But they're just as likely to teach inaccuracies. Because Indigenous documents and oral histories aren't treated as legitimate sources of knowledge. Because Indigenous ways of documentation aren't respected, and bluntly put, because our intellect isn't respected. We're not included in the writing of our own histories. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that you have to be Native to understand, research, or write Native history. But I am saying that if you do want to, you can't claim to study Native history without listening to the voices of Native people. And not just of one tribe. And you have to do so constantly. Because without Native voices, what you claim to call a Native history is just a story. It's as good as fiction. But that fiction is the basis of most public knowledge about our ancestors and our traditions. And though we can't change the past, we can choose to diversify our academic work today. Because the longer that we ignore Native history, the less accurate it will get, and the harder it will be to correct. And though we can't truly know what happened to our Native people 500 years ago, or even 100 years ago, we can get closer to the truth by listening to the descendants of the people that were there. All of them. Including those of us here at Duke. Though we make up less than 1% of the student population, many of us would be happy to talk to you, recommend a book, or point you towards an article that explains why certain words or mascots make us uncomfortable. Many of us have decided that it's time for this intellectual revolution, and we need allies. Around the world, histories are written by the victors. Native populations everywhere, China, Russia, Australia, are trying to reclaim their histories. We here in the Americas are struggling to prove to our professors, to historians and scholars, that their stories might be wrong. We're trying to survive, to get an education, and to raise our children to value our histories. I hope that you can begin to listen to us and value them too. Our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents are in your history books. Let us have a say in what gets said about them. Thank you for listening.